Book 2, Chapter 26, with names of the Mayflower passengers, from Bradford's History of the Plymouth Settlement, 1608 to 1650. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bradford's History of the Plymouth Settlement, 1608 to 1650, by William Bradford. Rendered into modern English by Harold Paget. Book 2, Chapter 26. About the middle of May this year, 3 men of war entered the harbour. The captain's name was Thomas Cromwell, and he had captured several prizes from the Spaniards in the West Indies. He had a commission from the Earl of Warwick. Aboard his vessel were about 80 strong young fellows, but very unruly, who, when they came ashore, so distempered themselves with drink that they became like madmen, and though some of them were punished and imprisoned, they could hardly be restrained. But in the end they became more moderate and orderly. They remained here about a month or 6 weeks, then going on to Massachusetts, in the meantime scattering a great deal of money among the people, and even more sin than money, I fear, notwithstanding all the care taken to prevent it. While they were here a sad accident occurred. One desperate fellow amongst them started wrangling with some of his comrades. Captain Cromwell commanded him to be quiet and cease his quarreling, but he would not, and reviled him with bad language, and in the end half drew his rapier intending to run at him; but the captain closed with him and snatched the rapier from him and gave him a box on the ear. Even then he would not give over, but continued to assault him. Whereupon the captain gave him a blow with the hilt of the rapier, just as it was in the scabbard. It chanced to hit his head, and the small end of the bar of the rapier hilt piercing his skull, he died a few days after. But the captain was exonerated by court-martial, for it appeared that the fellow was so quarrelsome that he had several times been chained under hatches to prevent him from hurting his comrades, to which they testified. This Captain Cromwell made another voyage to the West Indies from the Bay of Massachusetts, well manned and provisioned. He was out 3 years and took many prizes, and returned rich to Massachusetts. The same summer he had a fall from his horse, he fell on his rapier hilt, and bruised himself so badly that he died shortly after. It was remarked by some that this might show the hand of God, and that as one of his men had died of the blow he gave him with the rapier hilt, so his own death was caused by similar means. This year Mr. Edward Winslow went to England. Some discontented persons in Massachusetts had endeavoured to disturb the peace, and to undermine, if not upset their government, by uttering many slanders about them, and even intended to prosecute them in England by petitioning and complaining to Parliament. Samuel Gorton and his people also made complaints against them. So they chose Mr. Winslow, as their agent, to defend them, and gave him commission and instructions to that end. He managed things so well for them that he cleared them of all blame and dishonour, and disgraced their opponents. But owing to the great upheavals in the government there, he was detained longer than was expected, and later he met with other employments there, so that he has now been absent for 4 years, which has been much to the loss of this government. End of Book 2, Chapter 26. The names of those who came over first in the Mayflower, in the year 1620, and were by the blessing of God the first beginners and founders of the settlements and colonies of New England, with their families, written down A.D. 1650. John Carver, Catherine his wife, Desire Mentor, 2 men servants, John Howland and Roger Wilder, a boy, William Latham, a maid servant, a child who was put under his charge, called Jasper Moore. Mr. and Mrs. Carver, Wilder, and Jasper Moore all died here during the first general sickness. Desire Mentor returned to England, Latham stayed 20 years and then returned, the maidservant married here, and died a year or 2 after. Howland married Elizabeth Tilley. Both are living. They had 10 children. William Brewster, Mary his wife, 2 sons, Love and Wrestling, a boy in his charge called Richard Moore, and another of his brothers. The rest of his children were left behind, and came over afterwards. Mr. Brewster lived here 23 or 24 years, being about 80 when he died. His wife died some time before. Wrestling died unmarried. Love had 4 children, and died in 1650. The eldest son, who came after, had 9 children, and is still living, and the daughters, who came with him, married and are dead. The brother of Richard More died the first winter. Richard married and has 4 or 5 children. Edward Winslow, Elizabeth his wife, 2 men servants, George Sowell and Elias Story, a little girl in his charge, Ellen, sister of Richard More. Mr. Winslow's wife died the first winter. He married later the widow of Mr. White, and has 2 children living. Story and Ellen More died soon after the ship's arrival. George Sowell is living and has 8 children. William Bradford, Dorothy, his wife. Their only child, a son, was left behind, and came over after. Mrs. Bradford died soon after their arrival. Mr. Bradford married again, and had 4 children. Isaac Allerton, Mary his wife, 3 children, Bartholomew, Remember, and Mary, a servant boy, John Hook. Mrs. Allerton and the boy, Hook, died in the first general sickness. Bartholomew married in England. His daughter, Remember, married at Salem, and has 3 or 4 children living. Mary married here and has 4 children. Mr. Allerton married, secondly, a daughter of William Brewster, and had 1 son. He married a 3rd time, and left this place long ago. Samuel Fuller, a servant, William Button. His wife and a child were left behind, and came over afterwards. 2 more children were born here, and are living. Button died at sea. Mr. Fuller died 15 years ago. John Craxton, his son, John. John Craxton died in the first sickness. His son died 5 or 6 years after. He lost himself in the woods in winter, and his feet were frozen, which brought on fever. Miles Standish, Rose his wife. Mrs. Standish died in the first sickness. Captain Standish married again, and has 4 sons living. Christopher Martin, his wife, 2 servants, Solomon Prower and John Langmore. All these died in the first sickness, soon after their arrival. William Mullins, his wife, 2 children, Joseph and Priscilla, a servant, Robert Carter. All but Priscilla died in the first sickness. She married John Alden, both are living. They have 11 children. William White, Susanna his wife, 1 son, Resolved, and 1 born aboard ship called Peregrine. 2 servants, William Holbeck and Edward Thompson. Mr. White and his 2 servants died soon after their landing. His widow married Mr. Winslow. His 2 sons are living. Stephen Hopkins, Elizabeth his wife, 2 children by a former wife, Giles and Constanta, and 2 by this wife, Damaris and Oceanus, the latter born on the voyage. 2 servants, Edward Doty and Edward Lister. Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins lived here over 20 years, and had 1 son and 4 daughters born here. Doty is living, and has 7 children by a second wife. Lister went to Virginia, and died there. Richard Warren. His wife and 4 daughters were left behind and came afterwards, and 2 more were born here. Mr. Warren lived some 4 or 5 years here. John Billington. Ellen his wife, 2 sons, John and Francis. Billington was executed after he had been here 10 years. His eldest son died before him, his second is married. Edward Tilley. Anne his wife, 2 children, their cousins, Henry Sampson and Humility Cooper. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Tilley died soon after their arrival. Humility Cooper returned to England and died there. Henry Sampson is living and has 7 children. John Tilley, his wife, their daughter Elizabeth. Mr. and Mrs. John Tilley died soon after their arrival. Elizabeth married John Howland, see above. Francis Cook, his son John. Mrs. Cook and other children came over afterwards. 3 more children were born here. His son John is married. Mr. Cook is a very old man, and has seen his children's children have children. Thomas Rogers, Joseph his son. Mr. Rogers died in the first sickness. His son, Joseph, is living and has 6 children. The rest of his children came over afterwards, and are married, and have many children. Thomas Tinker, his wife, their son. All died in the first sickness. John Rigdale, Alice, his wife. Both died in the first sickness. James Chilton, his wife, their daughter Mary. Another daughter, who was married, came after. Mr. and Mrs. Chilton died in the first sickness. Mary Chilton married, and has 9 children. Edward Fuller, his wife, their son Samuel. Mr. and Mrs. Fuller died soon after they came ashore. Samuel Fuller is living, and has 4 children or more. John Turner, 2 sons. All died in the first sickness. His daughter came some years after to Salem, and is married. Francis Eaton, Sarah his wife, their baby Samuel. Mrs. Eaton died in the general sickness. Mr. Eaton married a second and third time, having 3 children by his third wife. Samuel is married and has a child. Moses Fletcher, John Goodman, Thomas Williams, Digery Priest, Edmund Margeson, Richard Britteridge, Richard Clark, Richard Gardner, Peter Brown, Gilbert Winslow. The first 7 died in the general sickness. Digery Priest's wife and children came afterwards, she being Mrs. Allerton's sister. Gardner became a sailor and died in England or at sea. Peter Brown married twice, leaving 4 children. He died about 16 years since. Gilbert Winslow, after several years here, returned to England and died there. John Alden. Mr. Alden was hired at Southampton as a cooper. Being a likely young man, he was desirable as a settler, but it was left to his own choice to stay here or return to England. He stayed and married Priscilla Mullins, see above. John Allerton, Thomas English, William Trevor, and one Eli. The first 2 were hired as sailors, the one to stay here with the shallop, the other to go back and help over those left behind; but both died here before the Mayflower returned. The last 2 were hired to stay here a year, both returned when their time was out. Of these 100 or so of persons who came over first, more than half died in the first general sickness. Of those that remained, some were too old to have children. Nevertheless, in those 30 years there have sprung up from that stock over 160 persons now living in this year 1650. And of the old stock itself nearly 30 persons still survive. Let the Lord have the praise, who is the high preserver of men. End of list of names of the Mayflower passengers. This recording by David Leeson. End of Bradford's History of the Plymouth Settlement, 1608 to 1650. By William Bradford, rendered into modern English by Harold Paget.